This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion.
This is one of those episodes, I've not gone down this rabbit hole yet. Selling your business. I've actually met people over the years. I guess you could call them business brokers or mergers and acquisition experts. Not to the size of a Goldman Sachs deal, but smaller businesses from hundreds of thousands of dollars to 10, 20 million, who knows? But there's a lot of business action out there, and a lot of people often want to sell their business. So my guest today caught my eye, her new book, Exit Rich, and it's all about what's the process? How do you exit? How the hell do you get out? She has some great war stories. Who is she? Her name is Michelle Seiler Tucker, and she's been at this game for many decades. She gets into the nitty-gritty, all aspects of selling a business, from just the evaluation part all the way to the negotiation part. It's a really fascinating backstory, too, how she got started. It's one of those Anthony Robbins tales almost, just finding her way into something she did not necessarily expect, and decades later sits in a catbird seat as the intermediary to help buy and sell businesses. What a great place to be. You always want to be the house, right? Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation with Michelle Seiler Tucker and get a little bit of that insight as to what we got to do when it's time to sell. So Michelle, I can think back for myself, the first time, and I don't know if I've said this exactly on the podcast before, maybe, but I thought back, the first time I ever made money as an entrepreneur, I was either 10 or 11. I just looked it up because it was connected to, I grew up in the state of Virginia. My father had a decent sized property. 1979, a guy was running to be the senator for the state of Virginia. He happened to have been married to a then Elizabeth Taylor. And so here I was, a 10 or 11-year-old kid, and there's going to be a big party with hundreds of people in the backyard of my parents' house, and one of these famous actresses is going to be there. I had an instant Polaroid camera, and I was walking around taking pictures of, and I still remember this to some degree as a 10 or 11-year-old boy, she did not look like her famous Hollywood times. She was older and just didn't look as good. But I got to tell you, I'm taking these Polaroid pictures, and these really creepy old men were coming up to me demanding these pictures. And I started selling them. So I was taking snapshots of Elizabeth Taylor, and old men were giving me $20 for a Polaroid. And that was when I knew, I was like, gosh, I love this feeling of selling something, right?
That's a great story. I love Elizabeth Taylor.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm sure there's a moment in time in your life, whether it was on your own or working for somebody, that first moment. And you're a master at selling. That first moment, though, where you sold something and you had the feeling. Well, I mean, give me a general period or something you were doing that was starting to shape you in terms of like, okay, wow, this selling thing is going to be big for me.
I think I started my first entrepreneurial endeavor when I was 14, selling wedding magazines. Then I went into sales at selling copiers and went into sales at Xerox, kind of got sucked into corporate America. I was very quickly called the closer at Xerox because anytime somebody couldn't close something, they would call me. And in fact, I did so well that they promoted me within 6 months to regional manager overseeing 85 salespeople. Well, at that point, I wasn't in charge of it.
Well, but why were you the closer? I want to know the skill set. What were you doing? What was the technique? What did you have that other people didn't have, but they saw it in you? What was it?
I think the bottom line is I'm a great listener and I really, really focus on what the clients need and want, can really determine rather quickly what their hot buttons are, how to give them what they want because clients buy what they want, not what they need. I think I just am very good at that. Obviously, I'm good at that. I've sold over 1,000 companies.
Hold on, but you said they buy what they want, not what they need. I'm probably going to be stopping you a lot here because you're not going to think this is so interesting, but to me it is because you are a master seller at these things. So it's about what they want, not what they need. Explain that.
You got to find the emotional hot buttons. You got to find what the clients are really wanting, what makes them tick, what they're willing to, what their hot buttons are. And I think that's what I'm really good at. Clients buy what they want, not really what they need. We go to the store to buy one thing, and what do? We end up walking out with a bunch of other things.
And the reason you're walking out with a bunch of other things is a sales process that is either going on directly in front of you or behind the scenes that the average person doesn't really see.
Correct.
How long did you stay at Xerox?
I was there for 6 months, and when I asked me to try out for this position, for this regional manager's position, they told me, Michelle, you'll never get it. I'm like, well, if I'm not going to get it, why should I apply? And I said, because it's great experience. So I ended up beating out people who have been there for decades. Shortly afterwards, I kind of realized I really didn't like that position. I really didn't like management. I like sales. I love the thrill of the deal. I like making lifetime relationships with my clients. I ended up really looking for another business to buy and was looking at franchises and stumbled across a franchise. I very quickly came across this one franchise that had a few locations. I was going to buy that, keep my six-figure job with great benefits. They came to me and said, well, Michelle, we don't want you to buy a franchise. We want you to become a partner with us. And I said, well, I'm not going to leave my six-figure position and become a partner when you're not really successful yourself. Anyway, they made me an offer. It was very difficult to refuse. And I said, well, let me try it out for 6 months, see how it goes. So I traveled and did trade shows, hosted my own events, did that for about 6 months while keeping my day job. Made more money with them in 6 months than I had made an entire year at Xerox. About 7-8 months later, I gave my resignation to Xerox and started my franchise development, franchise consulting, and franchise sales career.
Let me keep it at a line, though, that I saw from you that I really like, which is it's very simple. It's right at the front of your work. I was making a ton of money for someone else. Now, we could literally talk about that sentence for the next 60 minutes alone and why so few people in their life ever get to the point where they even consider that. I can already tell with your personality, you're kind of like, Mike, I'm already past that sentence. I already know. But you know what? Most people don't get that. They don't ever get a chance to experience that feeling of, I was making a ton of money for someone else, and I don't like that feeling, and I want to make more money.
It was that, plus it was also the fact that when I started managing 85 people, we were having meetings to have meetings to have meetings to schedule another meeting. And it was just so much corporate development traffic that I felt like we were really never getting anything done. I'm a salesperson through and through. And yes, I was making so much money for them versus money for myself and my family that's why I went ahead and took the leap. I left my six-figure position.
Let me keep it at the term salesperson for a second. I was thinking as I was going through your background, reading your work, I was thinking, okay, I've had a book agent various points in my life. I've hired real estate agents. How does that contrast or compare to someone like yourself who helps individuals to either buy or sell a business? And even if you want to compare it to the brokerage space, the stock market brokerage space, how does it compare and contrast in your mind?
Well, I'm a mergers and acquisitions master intermediary. I tell you, it's extremely different than being a stockbroker, selling a house, selling anything else, because you're dealing with someone's most prized possession. You're dealing with their livelihood. It's an emotional transaction for both buyers and sellers. So we're dealing with seller's remorse. We're dealing with buyer's remorse. Plus, there's a whole bunch of other caveats that we have to deal with that you never will have to deal with selling real estate or a stockbroker. You're dealing with employees. You're dealing with vendors. Their CPAs or landlords, their attorneys, franchisors in some cases. You're dealing with inventory, assets, real estate. You're dealing with what I call the 6 Ps, making sure that the business is functioning on all 6 Ps. So there's a lot more moving parts and a lot more obstacles that we have to overcome. And a lot of deals will fall apart in due diligence. You got to, it's like juggling a bunch of balls all up in the air in order to make sure that the sale happens. You're not dealing with that in real estate or most other industries and sales.
Let's take it back in time a little bit since I'm jumping you around. I hope you're comfortable enough with that. I think you probably are. I'm sure you probably talk as much as I talk. But take me back in time to the first time you sold or either sold or helped someone buy a business. Can you recall that time? I'd love to hear that story.
First, like I said, I started in franchise sales, franchise development, and franchise consulting. But then I had my partners buy me out and I transitioned into selling companies. And the very first business I sold was a flower shop. You don't know what you don't know, right? I had the seller, I found the buyer very quickly, had the buyer and seller hire an attorney, asked them if we had to have a lease. The attorney said, no, we don't have to have the lease. We can get the transfer of the lease done after the fact because the landlord was out of the country. We go to the closing, buyer and seller are there, and the attorney says, where's the lease? And I said, wait a minute, wait a minute. You told me we didn't have to have a lease. And he said, no, of course you have to have a lease. You can't close a deal without a lease. The whole deal blew up right there at the closing table. And we ended up closing a week later when the landlord came back in town. But that attorney gave me the wrong advice and then basically threw me under the table during the closing and really, really, really made me look bad in front of both my clients.
How did this process start to unfold early on? I mean, look, it's easy now to look back over hundreds and hundreds of sales, but how did the process of becoming the kind of matchmaker for buyer and seller, how did that process start to unfold? How did you start to regularly find the buyers and sellers? Was it a quick process for you? How did this unfold?
I think it was probably quicker for me than most. And the reason for that, number one, I've been in sales for a very long time. But number two, I had lots of referrals. I have owned other companies and I had referrals from those businesses. Plus I had referrals from those clients. Plus when I had my franchise development business, I had referrals from my franchisees. So my business took off rather quickly on a referral basis. But I also, did the typical things. I mean, back then, I don't think I did much Google or anything like that. It was mostly telemarketing. It was mostly referrals. It was even some direct cold calling in person back in those days and direct mail pieces, etc. But again, it was really referrals. I think probably pretty quickly I had 15, 20 sellers I was working with on a referral basis.
Give the audience some scope here. Like, for example, how small a deal have you done? How large of a deal have you done? Maybe a range of, 4 or 5 different types of businesses. I'm sure the range is quite wide, but I'm curious. I don't know. I want to hear from you the range on the sales and the types of businesses.
So over 1,000 transactions that my company has done. It's kind of hard to remember what's the lowest, what's the highest. I would say the lowest is probably 30,000. It was a kid's, like a bounce house that we sold. There might be a lower one. Like I said, out of 1,000 deals, it's hard to remember all the details. The largest one's probably been about 60, 70 million. Right now, we have several between 40 and 90 million that we're working on. Different industries. We sold an $18 million oil manufacturing business. This oil manufacturing business had been in business for probably 25, 30 years. It had 18 different patents, very unique. One business was thriving, the other business was dying. The thriving business was operating in all what we call the Seiler Tucker 6Ps, while the other one was headed into bankruptcy. We ended up finding probably about, 550 buyers. Now, we did not bring all 550 buyers to our seller, but we disclosed all 550 buyers. We qualified all 550 buyers. We narrowed it down. Well, not really narrowed it down, but I think we had 12 different LOIs. There's 5 different types of buyers. We had private equity groups. We had competitors and strategics. We had some serial entrepreneurs. So there's a serial entrepreneur that made us an offer on this business. It appraised in a $9.8 million range and made an offer for $15 million for 80% of the company. So the owner retained 20% plus their salary, plus their benefits. And then during due diligence, we ended up getting the buyer to agree to buy the other business for $3 million that was headed in that foreclosure. So $18 million for a company that was valued in the 9.8 for the business that was thriving. Due diligence was quite extensive. The deal almost fell apart for a multitude of reasons. I guess the biggest reason during due diligence on a Sunday was I kept noticing that when the buyer's due diligence expert was there, the seller's CPA kept shoving things in a drawer. And this deal included the buyer would receive all AR, but the seller would have to pay off all AP. She kept shoving things in a drawer. So anyway, when she left for the day, I started going through the drawers and realized that she was hiding all types of invoices that needed to be paid off by the seller at closing. We were also going to escrow money to make sure that those invoices were paid off. Come to find out, she had been embezzling money, stealing money from the seller.
You've had to have seen with this many different types of businesses, with this many different types of people. You've seen everything. So are you geographic in any particular area? Or are you all over America, beyond America? What are your borders?
I'm all over the USA. We are based in New Orleans, but we do deals all over. We've got some large deals we're working right now. Like I said, all over the United States. We have done deals in Canada, Colombia, Trinidad. I've been asked to go to Dubai and open up an office, which I would love to do. But with the internet, even before COVID, we were using Zoom. We were using all the technology. We saw businesses before sight unseen. We can really do what we do from right here from New Orleans, pretty much anywhere in the United States and Canada.
You ever just kind of scratch yourself and say, gosh, what an interesting journey. You're working for Xerox in sales, and then a complete shift to where you kind of get to be at the catbird seat of all these buyers and sellers and making a marriage. And of course, you get compensated for making that marriage. That's just a great feeling, I imagine.
It really is. And because I don't just sell businesses, I also buy businesses and flip them. I also partner with business owners whose businesses are not really sellable for the price tag that the owner needs to exit. So I'll partner with a business owner, investing my money, time, energy, effort, resources. Sometimes I'll bring on additional partners. And it really is a marriage. I have lifetime friends from franchisees that I sold over 20 years ago, obviously business partners that I'm in business with now, sellers of businesses I've sold. One of my best friends is a business I sold back in 2005, right after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans.
Let me ask you the big Amazon question. I mean, I know I can probably get in a car and drive across America and see hollowed out stores and malls that are honestly empty because of Amazon. I mean, people love the convenience, and just like my father, he loves getting those brown boxes every day with goodies, This is American life. This has had to have been an interesting observation for you because at the size and scope of the businesses that you're describing, some of your would-be buyers and sellers have probably been hurt dramatically by an Amazon.
They have. And, when I wrote my first book in 2013 called Sell Your Business for More Than It's Worth, I did extensive research, and it was common knowledge back then, and common knowledge now, people think this anyway, that it used to be that 85 to 95% of all businesses will go out of business. Well, when I wrote Exit Rich in 2019, I did extensive research again. I had my team do the research, and I was flabbergasted by the results because the business landscape has changed dramatically. There's 30.2 million businesses in the United States, employing over half of America's workforce. Back in 2013, 85 to 95% of startups, 1 to 5 years, will go out of business. Now, out of 27.6 million, now remember, there's 30.2 million businesses, out of 27.6 million, 70% of businesses that have been in business 10 years or longer are at great risk for going out of business. 70%. Do the math. These businesses are dropping like flies. You hear about the big box stores all the time. The public companies like Toys R Us, Kmart, JCPenney's, GNC just closed down 900 locations. But what you're not hearing about are the private companies, the smaller businesses on every street corner in every town in every state across our great nation that are dropping like flies. And unfortunately, many of these business owners are going to be forced into closing their businesses, selling for pennies on the dollar, or even worse, filing bankruptcy. And when business owners file bankruptcy, they're not just losing their business assets, they're losing their family assets too, because most business owners commingle assets. Yes, Amazon has taken a lot of that business, but owners who've been in business over 10 years have stopped doing two things. I call it AIM. They stopped aiming. They stopped innovating and marketing. They stopped asking their clients, what do you want? How can I make it easier for you to do business with me? The ones who make it easiest for consumers to do business with them are the ones who are going to be winning. And that's why Amazon wins, because Amazon makes it easy for anyone to buy almost anything you want and have it delivered on Prime within a few days.
Look, I am the biggest saluter of Jeff Bezos and the American system. Pick a great idea. If everyone loves it, you make a lot of money. He's done that. It's going to be interesting to see over time, though, if all of the smaller businesses kind of get eaten up in literally one person's success. You know, if all these small businesses kind of go away, and maybe, as you point out, with the AIM, they weren't going the right direction. And so somebody like Jeff swoops in and he's got a great idea. But it's a real conundrum here as a capitalist that you're talking to, and I'm sure you are too. It's a real conundrum if everything kind of goes away, literally almost, and then it's in the control of one company. Oof, I don't know what to do with that.
I agree 1,000%. And, you know, what business owners have to start doing is they have to start innovating. I mean, just look at Toys R Us. Toys R Us started in what, 1940?
And for how long they were exactly the same with no innovation?
Exactly the same. When they started Toys R Us, they modeled it after a grocery store where they would stack toys all the way up to the ceiling. And that was their model. Never did they change their model. Never did they innovate. Never did they do anything different. Same thing with Blockbuster. Blockbuster saw Netflix. They saw the writing on the wall. They did nothing. They sat there fat and happy and did nothing. And that's why it ended up going out of business. And that's a problem with these retailers. They're not innovating. They're not creating a business and pivoting with a customer experience in mind.
I can think back to being a kid going to Toys R Us. I'm 52 now. You go to Toys R Us, and like you said, it was just metal shelves with the stuff stacked. There was no experience. You still loved it as a kid, but you look at it now and you're like, gosh, they were doing nothing except just stacking the merchandise up and expecting you to buy it.
And if you watch the movie Home Alone, I don't know if you ever watched that movie, but I watch it like every weekend with my 10-year-old. Home Alone 1, Home Alone 2. Home Alone 2, remember? The little boy is at the toy store. I think it was FAQ Schwartz.
Yeah.
They show all these experiences and everything at that toy store. Well, Toys R Us never provided any experiences. What are consumers into? Consumers are into experiences. They would rather stay at home, order what they need, get it shipped to them in a few days, and spend the rest of their time on quality experiences with their family. That's the problem with these business owners. Business owners have to start asking themselves, what business am I in and what business should I be in?
Now, have you started to, or are you already selling completely online businesses, whether they're advertising or informational businesses? You're in that business as well, too.
I am. We are industry agnostic. We're more EBITDA focused. Absolutely. We've sold e-commerce businesses. We have online training businesses, online education, all types of businesses. We're pretty much in every industry.
Is there an aggregate number in terms of your total sales? It's got to be quite big, I'm guessing.
Total sales?
Well, I mean, just in terms of like the number of how much volume. I mean, you know, if you do this many transactions and some of the numbers you're talking about, it adds up.
One thing I wish I would have done, I always say, okay, well, if I could have done something differently, what would I have done differently? Probably kept better records on the size of the deals, the industries, et cetera. But yeah, it's a huge amount for sure.
Let me ask you about some of the businesses that you're seeing, the e-commerce businesses. What trends, what are you seeing in that particular space? Because this can often be a lot of very young people figuring out a niche. They could be extremely young and making a boatload of money. And then they're potentially selling in boom, boom, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am.
Typically, our client has always been 50 and up. Baby boomers has typically always been our clients for brick and mortar locations. And now we are working with a lot of e-commerce businesses, SaaS businesses, and those tend to be younger business owners for sure. And it's good and bad. One of the issues that I see with some of these younger business owners for these SaaS businesses or e-commerce business is that they're not really building a foundation, meaning that like we have one client that sells on Amazon, sells on their website. I would say 85% of their business comes from Amazon. If they lose Amazon, they're out of business. The problem is with this company, they don't really have anything. They don't really have an infrastructure. Yes, they have a product. Yes, they manufacture out of China. They don't have any contracts in place. They have no backup plan if they lose that manufacturer. They have, I think, one patent. They don't have any employees. When we evaluate businesses, we evaluate them on the 6 Ps. Number one is people. A lot of these companies don't really have people. They're outsourcing everything. And it's good and bad. It's good from the standpoint that you have lower overhead. It's bad from the standpoint that you're not really functioning on what I call all 6 Ps that make a business successful. So this company has no people in place. They have no management team in place. They rely on outsourcing everything. They outsource their customer service. They outsource their sales. They outsource their marketing. Other than the owner, there is really nobody. They brought in one individual that is trying to take control and do operations and do management, and they're trying to train this person. But the business is not really sellable right now unless we sell it to strategic that has the infrastructure in place. And that's what I see with a lot of the younger generation is, yes, they can make money. They figure that out. And yes, they can sell products, but they don't really have the infrastructure that's going to be sellable that most buyers are looking for when they buy a business.
Yeah, what's so interesting about that is I don't know if you're aware, you probably are, but I think the root of that is actually somebody who's been on this podcast, who's quite successful, a very successful author, very successful podcaster. And he wrote the 4-Hour Work Week, Tim Ferriss. And Tim was the one that said, travel the world, get rid of the infrastructure, get lean and mean. I know a lot of guys that made a bloody fortune doing that, very what you're describing. But you're pointing out the risk. It's not even a hidden risk that if you outsource everything and then you want to sell what you have, the buyer is going to go, oh, okay, what am I buying?
Exactly. Buyers want to buy a business that has people, right? You can't really operate a business without people. They want to make sure there's a management team in place. They want to make sure that there's some non-competes in place. And they want to make sure that there's tenured, loyal employees. And they buy a product. They want to make sure the product is thriving, not dying. They want to make sure processes are in place and are efficient and are designed with the customer experience in mind. And then proprietary. They want to make sure there's some patents, there's some trademarks, there's some IP. They want to make sure that the business is well branded. And then they want to make sure there's customer diversification, which is patrons, and then obviously profits. Everybody wants to buy a business that's profitable. I always say profits is never, ever the problem. It's always a symptom of not having the right people in place or not having the right product or not having your processes efficient, not protecting your IP. So that's what buyers are looking for. They have to have that infrastructure. And yes, we're going to be able to sell his company, but we're not going to be able to maximize the value.
So that's really the issue, is that you can get a number. It's just not going to be the number that you know that you can get if they're kind of covering all their bases.
And then the other thing, a lot of these owners are like, well, I had a great year, because it takes these SaaS companies, it takes these online e-commerce businesses, it takes them time to really build up the momentum and start making some great EBITDA. The problem is all these owners want to base the value on 1 year. Buyers are not going to base the value on 1 year. They want to look at 3-year history.
That kind of stuff, yeah, I can't even imagine as a buyer. I mean, I know there are people that do it, though. There is an audience out there that gets it's a higher risk appetite where they feel like, I'll take a stab at this.
Well, if the right synergies are in place, then yes. It's like Facebook paid $19 billion for WhatsApp, and WhatsApp was hemorrhaging money. So you're right. If the right synergies are there and the buyer thinks that they could ROI or monetize those synergies, then yes, they're willing to pay for those synergies, and they're willing to pay a pretty handsome price for such. And maybe even if the company is not operating on all 6 cylinders, they'll still buy, like Facebook bought WhatsApp, because WhatsApp had 1 billion users and they knew they could monetize that.
But if a man or a lady's out there and they're 70 years old and they've got $5 million in the bank and they want to buy a business, they want to buy something that's going to have a certain turnkey aspect to it.
Correct. And those are mostly first-time buyers, and first-time buyers are 90% of the buyers. And yes, they want something with stability. They want a turnkey aspect, etc. These e-commerce businesses and online businesses are attractive to buyers, but they're going to be more attractive to competitors and strategics. They won't be attracted to private equity groups, and they probably won't be attracted to sophisticateds.
Interesting. I saw the line, and you'll have to update me on the number, but it's when a business goes to sell, 90% of listed businesses, and however they're listed, ultimately don't sell. So selling a business, even if you want to do it, your chances for success are not high.
They're not. And 90% is thrown out there. I'm going to go with Steve Forbes. But Steve Forbes says 8 out of 10 businesses will not sell. 8 out of 10. And that's true. 8 out of 10 businesses will not sell. That's why we work with our business owners to get their business to operate on all 6 Ps, to get their business to a solid foundation, make sure it's sustainable, scalable, so that we can sell the business.
Okay, let me get into the nitty gritty here of a skill set that you have. And I want to know what's going on in your mind. I want to know the technique. I want to know how you move the pieces on the playing board. And that's when you have a seller and you have multiple potential buyers. Now, I can think back to my first book, no name author. The publisher gave me $15,000. Okay. The second book came after the first book sold 100,000 copies. So then all of a sudden I had an agent and I had a bidding war. And that was really interesting to watch. I was like, wow, 6 major New York publishers are having a bidding war. And the disparity between the bids was amazing. There was a couple that were at the very high, but some of the others dropped off kind of quick. So the whole process was amazing. Let's talk about bidding wars. When you have that potential seller, whatever the business, whatever the amount, and let's say you've got at least 2 very eager buyers that want that baby. Talk about managing this process to get your seller the highest amount of money.
First and foremost, I always talk with my clients at the beginning, because some business owners, believe it or not, and this might shock you, this might shock your audience, some business owners don't want a bidding war, believe it or not. What they want is they want to make sure that the seller of their business meets the seller sanity check. They want to make sure that the buyer is going to take great care of their employees, their clients, grow their legacy, and of course, they want the price tag to afford their lifestyle when they exit their business. I had a $15 million business that we sold in South Louisiana. It was appraised in the $9 million range. We had probably about 600 buyers for that. Again, we don't bring all 600 buyers to our clients, so I don't want your audience to misinterpret that. We disclose and qualify 600 buyers, and we narrow it down. We probably had about 10 LOIs on that particular business. It got to a bidding war type situation, but then right away our sellers said, hold on a minute. We don't want to go back and forth. We don't want to play this game. This is the buyer we really like, because we feel that they're going to grow our legacy. We feel they're going to take care of our clients. We feel that we can move forward with this company, these buyers, versus some of the other buyers that want to pay more and buy our business. Now, we still got our client $15 million for 70% of the business, 70% of the business, when the business was appraised in the $9 million range. And this was a strategic buyer because they had similar products, similar services, but different. And they didn't have the patents that my client had. Plus, my client had 60% of his revenue tied up in one customer, which was BP. And that would scare most buyers. But this buyer was interested in paying a good price for it. And I had another buyer that was willing to pay more, but my seller said, no, we're going to go with this buyer. So not all sellers want to get into a bidding war. They really want to be comfortable and have that warm and fuzzy feeling that who they're entering partnership with. Because when you get to this level, it's not always about selling 100% of the business. A lot of times it's going to be 70, 80, 90%.
I should add that when I did that contract for my second book and got a publisher, very good publisher, and I'm not hiding anything here because people could figure out who the publisher is pretty quick. But I got to say, in hindsight, there were pros and cons for sure. There were absolute pros and cons, and that one can make a very good argument that I could have taken $100,000 less to go with a smaller publisher where I had perhaps more control than the expensive deal with the top publisher where you had far less control.
Yeah, that's very interesting because one of our endorsements is Jack Canfield, and they wrote Chicken Soup for the Soul. And one of the things that they always talked about is their expensive publisher agreement, and they got a great price, and their publisher outpaid everybody else or outbid everybody else. But then they felt like they ended up losing money on the royalties, and they could have went with less fees up front and got more money on the back end. You got to look at the whole picture. It's not just about the price.
Yeah, but you got to have experience to know that, right? Jack's been on this show. He's great. I loved his conversation. Because if you think about it, I love watching some of the antique car shows. It's not the same thing. So if you got 100 people in the room and they're all bidding on an antique car, I mean, I guess in some level, the owner wants to make sure the antique car is going to be taken care of. But ultimately, in that situation, it's the highest price. But some of the examples that you and I are talking about, it's more complicated.
Yeah, especially when you have a seller. Look, most sellers are attached to their business. It's their baby. I can tell you, I've had sellers walk out of due diligence. I've had sellers walk out of the closing room because it's their baby and they suffer from seller's remorse. It's really a whole process that we have to take our sellers through, an educational process, and we have to get them comfortable with exiting. We have to get them comfortable with what's next in their life. I always tell people that we'll never exit a seller from their business until we help them plan their future.
You've mentioned patents, proprietary aspects. When you are helping a seller to sell, speak to confidentiality. I have to imagine that in a competitive world, some potential buyers are not really buyers. Perhaps they're just looking to gather information. That happens.
Yep, you're absolutely right. And that's why it's so important for a seller to hire a mergers and acquisitions advisor, because especially competitors, they just want to know who's up for sale. They want the dirt, so to speak, on their competitor. You really have to be careful. Again, I've been doing this over 20 years. Confidentiality is our number one priority. We advertise everything extremely discreetly. When there's an industry, like we have an industry right now that really doesn't hardly have any competitors, maybe two, we have to advertise that very discreetly and not really give away any proprietary information whatsoever. Also, when we disclose buyers and its competitors, we stole a staffing agency that appraised in the $30 million range. We probably had about 200, 300 staffing agencies interested. Every single time we would email our client and they had to prove it in writing before we would give information on their company. So we never, ever show information on our client's company to a competitor without their expressed permission in writing to do so.
Yeah, because you're in that situation where you're at. If anybody thinks you're not playing completely on the up, then it's a trust factor. Like your whole business is based on that.
Absolutely. And that's why we have to qualify buyers. And you'd be surprised how many advisors and business brokers don't qualify buyers. We qualify buyers. I don't care how rich they are or how much money they have or how big their business is. We want their financials or we want a letter from their bank. Because if you're showing a business to an unqualified buyer, then you're risking breach of confidentiality. So we qualify all buyers. We always obtain their financials or a letter from their bank or something that proves that they can afford to buy the business. I would tell you, confidentiality is typically never breached by the broker or the advisor. It's typically breached by the owner. The owner tells somebody who tells somebody who tells somebody. And then before you know it, everybody knows.
I think I've woken you up now. When I first got you on the phone, you're like, oh, it's 7:00.
7 o'clock on a Monday. No, it's fine.
No, it's a fascinating process. Let's talk about, I brought up the example, the hypothetical buyer, let's say 70 years old, has multi-millions to potentially buy. Talk about some of the businesses out there. And this is just more of a kind of a broad question. I'm sure some people in the audience are thinking about this. Is like, okay, if I've got some extra money and I want to trust the kind of thinking that Michelle is talking about, something that's somewhat turnkey, with all these different, the P's that you talk about. What are some of the types of businesses that people that are not spending 60 million, but people that are spending, the lower amounts where they can, instead of just only putting it into the stock market and a passive index fund, what are some of the types of businesses that people can imagine become available for sale? Something, let's say a business that's $1 million or a business that's $5 million. What types of businesses can the average person who has worked their life and has made a decent chunk of change and they want something different than passive index, what are some of the ranges of businesses that become available?
Before I answer this question, I just want to clarify. Did you say the buyer's age was 70?
You pick the age, 50, 60, 70.
Okay.
I mean, not too many 30-year-olds are going to have the 5 million or the 10 million. So, I just put up an age, a higher age,
Yeah. Look, the bigger the business, typically, not always, but the larger the business, typically the easier it is to run. Because in most cases, not always, I don't even know if I should say most, but these businesses should operate on all 6 Ps. They should have the right people in place. They should be in the right industry. But remember, businesses that have been in business for over 10 years are at risk for going out of business because they stopped innovating and marketing. But some of these industries, in that 5 to 10 million, or let's say 2 to 10 million, that are, I don't know if you want to say easy to own and operate, but they are maybe easier than other industries. Dental lab, we sell a lot of dental labs. As long as you have the technicians in place, you got a management team. We're closing on one, I think in December. That's a good industry. That's a stable industry. It's sustainable. It's not really going anywhere. Yes, technology is coming in, but you're still going to need technicians. That's a good industry. Staffing is always a good industry. It's always hot. It's always in demand. But again, you just got to make sure that they have the right people in place, because it can be a difficult and stressful business to operate. I took a lady who was in banking for decades, and she was 5 years away from retirement. She called our office. She wanted to buy a restaurant. Her name is Brenda. I started asking her questions. I'm like, Brenda, why do you want to own a restaurant? She goes, well, I've always wanted to own a restaurant. I said, have you ever worked in one? She said, no. I said, do you have any family members that have worked in one? She said, no. I said, what experience do you have? She says, none. I said, you don't want to own a restaurant. The first thing that we want to do is qualify buyers, especially first-time buyers, on not how much money they have, but how much they're willing to spend. Because just because you have it doesn't mean you're willing to spend it. You got to make sure that they're willing to pull the trigger. So she had about $350,000 to spend, $300,000 to put down on a business, $50,000 for working capital. She was pulling money out of a retirement fund, which you can do to buy a business without paying any taxes or penalties. I said, look, well, I'm not going to put you in a restaurant. That would be the worst thing I could ever do for you. And she really didn't have an industry in mind. I ended up putting her in a flooring business. She said, Michelle, I just want to make more than what I'm making now. I've been in banking for 30 plus years. I'm making about 125, 150. I would like to make around 200, 250. This business was making over $400,000 a year. It included the real estate. I talked the sellers into only taking $300,000 down, which was pretty much unheard of, because that was, I think, like 15, 20%. They took it, put her in this business. She, even after paying debt service to the owners seller financed it. They were the bank. She's making over $350,000 a year. She has recently expanded the business and is making $500,000 a year now.
That's a great story. I mean, that's the kind of story, if people hear it, people kind of think, oh, wow, that's motivating. And then they're going to kind of like, oh, what else can Michelle tell me?
And the key, the secret sauce here really is just finding a good advisor that's got your best interest in mind, and not just trying to sell you something, not just trying to make commissions, but really has your best interest at heart and is going to make the right fit So you're happy long term and it meets all your criteria as far as what you want to make. And find a business that, because SBA would have never worked for her for a multitude of reasons, but find a business that a seller will seller finance. Most of our clients, especially in the lower size, and I think this was like a 3, I can't remember the size of the business, but at any rate, a lot of sellers will agree to seller finance. So I can get buyers, first-time buyers into businesses with, maybe 20, 30% down.
It's interesting you mentioned about the restaurants. I've been binge watching recently Gordon Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares and Hotel Hell. And I got to tell you how many of these owners just like, I just decided to buy it. I don't have any experience in it at all. He just shakes his head every time.
And, I think you can buy a lot of industries. Like that's what sophisticated buyers do, serial entrepreneurs. You can buy a lot of businesses without having any experience, but restaurants are not one of them.
Let's talk about one last issue in our conversation today. I'm curious, I think we briefly mentioned it, but COVID. And we've talked about the closing of America, and we've talked about the reasons why a Toys R Us collapses and all that kind of fun stuff. But COVID is an extra nightmare on top of the lack of innovation and the lack of new insights and whatnot. Speak to COVID from your perspective right now, because it really looks like you start to think, gosh, is America turning the corner? And then doesn't look like it, and lockdowns, and it's almost like we imagine we can just shut everything down and then turn it on a year later or 2 years later and it'll all still be there. That's probably not going to be the case.
No, probably not. And several industries are going to have a tough time coming back if they ever come back at all. I've seen industries that were not doing well before COVID that are now thriving. I mean, manufacturing is crushing it. And we have several manufacturing companies for sale right now where we have, hundreds and hundreds of buyers that want manufacturing. So manufacturing is crushing it. But hospitality, anything hospitality-wise,
they're getting crushed.
They're getting crushed. Hospitality, anything with the tour industry, of course, airlines, event space, etc. Photographers are having a hard time. Just think about who all's involved in hospitality, and those industries are really dying right now. But it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, a lot of these restaurants and hotels, restaurants especially, they can turn it around. They can pivot. If they just think outside the box or throw the box away, there are so many things that they can do to stay in business. And they might not do as well as they were before COVID, but they can survive. And then when this is over, they can thrive. I always tell my clients, you just have to pivot. You just got to ask yourself, what business are you in? I mean, I'll give you a great story. Commander's Palace is one of the most famous restaurants in all of New Orleans. And they ask themselves, what business are they in? Well, they're in the experience business, creating experiences. So how can they still create experiences with COVID? Well, what they came up with is wine and cheese tasting. They can do wine and cheese tasting between $150 to $500. They'll send you a package. Anywhere in the U.S., actually anywhere in the world, you can join. Now, of course, you're not going to get their wine and cheese. You'll go somewhere local. But I went on this wine and cheese Zoom hosting event, and there was about, 600, 700, 800 people on there. And the majority of them were from New Orleans. So they were making money and they were creating experiences. And then there was another chef, a famous chef, that says, hey, I'm going to send you a package to your house, and I'm going to do a Zoom call with you and do a cooking experience with your family. So there's a lot of different ways that industries, businesses can turn things around and just pivot and do things differently. You just really got to think about the way you used to do business is not the way you should do business anymore. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, you did. I'm thinking there's a classic book out there called The Experience Economy, and it kind of talks about coffee. And it's like, okay, you got the commodity, and then you can buy your base coffee somewhere. That's the service. And then you got the experience, which is ultimately kind of the Starbucks type of thing. And people will ultimately pay, and you know this more than me, people will ultimately pay almost anything for an experience that transforms them.
That's right. And that's why retail is dying. Retail is dying, Michael, because so many businesses like Toys R Us never created an experience. It is a chore to go to Toys R Us. It is a nightmare, especially during the holidays. You got to fight the crowds. Nobody in there knows what they're doing. Nobody can really help you. It's not an experience. It is a nightmare. And a lot of these retailers have created nightmares, not experiences. And that's the issue.
The funny thing about that is that Amazon is not creating the experience. So the opportunity for an experience is still there. Amazon's not creating an experience.
Exactly.
Except getting the product fast. I mean, that's it. It's an efficient experience.
And what they've done, what Amazon has done is made it easy for the consumer to buy what they need and buy what they want. And that's what's great. And I think one thing that did come good out of COVID, especially for my household, is we don't have to go to the grocery store anymore. We can get everything delivered to our doorstep. And that's awesome because I hate going to the grocery store. So I think that's great. But, Toys R Us is opening back up with 5 locations. They're going to be much smaller boutique stores providing experiences. And that's what retailers are going to have to start doing. If not, you're going to see more retailers drop like flies.
Interesting story, interesting life, interesting business that you are in the middle of. Once I get you rolling, I could probably just pick your mind for hours, I'm sure. I could just take you down kinds of stores. But you could probably only tell me so much because you do have these confidentialities and NDAs. You can only tell me so many cool stories about all these interesting people that you've met behind the scenes, buyers and sellers. I can only imagine.
I can tell you great stories. I can tell you great stories about what not to do, how not to mess up your business. I've seen it all.
What's the biggest thing people do to mess up their business, to mess up the sale? What are the top 1 or 2 things that people do?
Well, let me give you a story. So you heard me talk about a staffing company, right? $30 million staffing company. The owner decides that he's going to leave. So one thing he told me during the process is he said, Michelle, everything's in a trust. I'm untouchable. Nobody can touch me. Well, my skin kind of crawls when someone tells me that because I'm like, okay, why are you telling me that? But anyway, throughout the process of selling his business, like I said, we had over 250 staffing agencies. We had hundreds and hundreds of buyers. We could have sold this business for over $30 million. He decides to leave his wife and marry his high school sweetheart while he's already married, by the way, which is illegal. Then they have a catastrophic injury that occurs because they're in industrial staffing and an employee loses a limb. Then right before Christmas, he falsifies information on workers' comp reports.
While he's trying to sell this.
Correct. They lose their workers' comp insurance, I want to say around October. The business started trending downward very, very, very quickly. They went from $3 million in EBITDA down to hardly nothing, ended up in bankruptcy court. I ended up selling the business for $1.2 million in bankruptcy court as a stalking horse from my buyer who was going to pay millions for it.
So what would you call, I mean, I can think, and I'm sure the audience can think in their own mind, how they would describe the behavior of that particular person. How would you describe the behavior? Is it just, a certain ignorance, a certain stupidity, just cavalier, overconfident?
Or narcissist.
Narcissist. There you go.
He thought he was untouchable.
Yeah, there you go.
He's a narcissist. He didn't care about any of the employees. Everybody lost their jobs. He didn't care about any of his clients. He didn't care about any of the employees. I'm in bankruptcy court being grilled by his wife's attorney. Luckily, I was still able to sell it to pay off most of the debt, not all the debt. But that's probably the worst in 20 years. That's the worst I've seen. But I've seen all kinds of crazy stuff that owners do that just mess up their business. I don't know if it's not ignorance. I think, it's narcissists. I think a lot of them think they're untouchable.
They just get too cocky.
I think it's more than cocky.
I don't know. There's too much money in the bank or whatnot. And they just, as you say, they just think they're untouchable. And then something breaks, something goes away.
The biggest mistake that business owners make is not planning their exit. That's number one. Business owners don't really think about their exit until a catastrophic event has occurred, internal or external, like COVID or, health issues, divorce, partner disputes. You really should be thinking about your exit from day one, and you should build a business that's actually sellable. Most businesses don't sell because they're not sellable, and they're certainly not sellable for the price tag that the owner wants.
And that is some of the detail that people are going to have to check out in your book, because you really do get into the nitty-gritty of this whole process, cradle to grave. In an hour, we can only just kind of touch on some highlights and stuff. The book, Exit Rich, the 6P Method to Sell Your Business for Huge Profit. Michelle, cool stuff. Fun conversation. I hope you enjoyed yourself.
I did.
7 a.m. in New Orleans.
I would love to come back on and go into greater detail. Also, everybody can get the book at exitrichbook.com, where Right now, we're providing extra value just for pre-sales, Michael.
Well, that's going to be the main website, because I want to make sure to ask you that. The main website where people can go is?
ExitRichBook.com.
Very cool stuff. Hopefully when I can make it back to the country and all this COVID stuff is over, I have to come through New Orleans and let me buy you lunch. You tell me where to go and I get to buy. There we go.
All right. You buy lunch and then I'll buy dinner.
Sounds like a deal.
My favorite restaurant is Emerald's, Legacy's restaurant.
Look, I just made the open-ended offer, so I kind of like, I'm whatever it gets handed. I'm there with the bills. So there we go. Hey, Michelle, listen, thank you for coming on tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.